It's great to welcome to the program today Renato Mariotti, who's a former federal prosecutor, CNN legal analyst, and Politico Legal Affairs columnist. Great to have you on. Really appreciate it.
Happy to be on. Thank you.
So let's just dive right into it. My perspective on the Barr team's handling of the end of the Mueller investigation and the release of the report has been that I think they've executed it quite well. They've executed it well in terms of the release of this 4-page letter that preceded the actual report by a couple of weeks. Most Americans are not going to page through a 450-page report, understandably. They have jobs. They've got to get their kids to school. I understand it. And that letter was a really great basis for what I'm calling the exoneration tour. So, like, big picture, what's your sense? Do you agree that this was pretty good strategy? Could they have done better?
Yeah, I have to say it's master deception by Barr. I think it's good for Barr, good for Trump, bad for America. And what I would say is that what we were promised, what the United States Senate was promised by Barr was transparency, that he would lay out this report and its findings for the American people, and he failed to do so. He deliberately failed to do so, even when Mueller was urging him on multiple occasions to release the summaries, which really contain everything. I mean, if somebody reads the summaries, they basically get the gist of what happened in the report. Um, Barr deliberately hid those summaries for weeks while he had this very highly misleading letter that was out there and was setting the narrative. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that he misled America, misled Congress, and that's not what an attorney general is supposed to be doing. But it worked as a political matter. It appears to have worked very well.
As we've started to learn a bit about some of the conversations and the mindset of Mueller's prosecutors throughout the process, for example, as one example, we recently learned from a report that a couple of prosecutors a year or a year and a half ago sort of determined that they believed that the president had committed obstruction, but that for what are effectively political reasons, the difficulty, if not impossibility, depending on who you ask, of indicting a sitting president, that it was sort of let go. That's my terminology, not theirs. When you saw that report, does that strike you, generally speaking, as the type of conversation that prosecutors would have? Or was there something about the generalities of how those prosecutors are reported to have been thinking about this that doesn't line up with how your experience is that prosecutors behave and talk and think about charges?
Wow. Well, I mean, here you're talking about investigation of the president of the United States, and so the Mueller team always knew that the way this was going to end was going to be different than the way that most investigations end. Okay, when I was a prosecutor, I was thinking about what would my indictment look like? What charges am I going to bring? What do I need to prove to carry those charges? And so the conversation was always about what a trial would look like, what the evidence would look like at trial. And then for the Mueller team, it was always going to be a different sort of question, a different sort of analysis. The question would always be, not anything about a trial or whether or not they would be able to prevail, but whether or not there would be sufficient evidence to support some sort of findings regarding the president or his associates or things like that. Now, if certainly, I think there were some charging decisions that were made as to other individuals, whether it was Trump Jr. or Roger Stone or others. But as to the president, I think um, the conversation was very unusual and different than a typical conversation would be. And then the separate question, the separate issue is, what do you do about that? And Mueller came up with one answer. Barr came up with another. I mean, for Mueller, um, the question, the conclusion was, because we can't indict, it would be unfair to Trump for us to reach a conclusion that he couldn't go to court and rebut in the way that a typical defendant could. Barr has leaped into this and saying no. I mean, in fact, his testimony today before the Senate is no, it would be improper not to reach a conclusion. But then instead of going to Mueller and asking him to make the conclusion, he made the conclusion himself, which I think fits with what you said earlier, which is that the goal here was to deceive or hide or control or spin or whatever word you want to use to suggest that he's think giving a picture to the American public that's inconsistent with the report itself.
So you sort of alluding to something that is related to this in a way, which is that a lot of non-lawyers have issued different opinions about the importance of the use of certain legalese in the Barr letter and in the Mueller report. The use of the word establish in some cases, find in others, as one example. Can you
Sure.
give us a sense of, I mean, is that a reasonable analysis to be doing? Is that actually going to give us any insight into sort of what is being said versus what is being implied, or are those analyses not particularly useful?
Are we talking about I'm sorry, are you asking about the Mueller report or the Barr letter?
Really, both. I mean, let's start with the Barr letter, right? The use
Sure.
of did not establish versus there is no evidence, and sort of all of these different semantic arguments that were made by non-legal analysts.
Here's what I would say. The Barr letter is crafted in a way to, I would say, mischaracterize the Mueller report. Barr was trying to find a way to write a letter that was technically accurate so that you could not point to a word and say, this is a lie. This sentence is a complete lie. So that it's technically accurate, but it's highly misleading. So he quoted half of a sentence here or a clause there from the report. He never quoted a full sentence from the Mueller report. And then he used words that were, as you're suggesting, soft. Well, it didn't establish this, didn't reach this conclusion, whatever. So that those are not legal terms deliberately, because then this way there could be a disagreement as to what establishing meant. So I'd say that the Barr letter was a masterwork of deception. That would be the conclusion that I draw. I would say that the Mueller report is something very different. The Mueller report is very careful and guarded and humble. I mean, I'd say that Mueller's approach is very humble, which is how we expect a prosecutor to be. In other words, if you had a picture of the ideal prosecutor, it would be someone who's humble, who has a sense of fair play, who doesn't go beyond what is strictly known. Prosecutors are supposed to be that way, and unfortunately, they often fall short of that in real life. But Robert Mueller, I think, was trying to do whatever he could to reach that ideal.
What do you make of the motivation to include some of the particular footnotes that are in the Mueller report? Just to pick one, there's this footnote in volume 2. I think it's either like 1090 or 1091, which in short, and correct me if my interpretation is wrong, as a non-legal interpretation, it says that whether or not there is impeachment, that barring some kind of statute of limitations that would preclude this, that a president can be indicted after they are no longer president of the United States. What do you think was the significance or motivation for putting something like that in a footnote?
I think the motivation was to explain why detailed findings are being set forth on issues that aren't going to result in charges. So typically, let's say I'm investigating a bank robbery, okay, a typical federal crime. Well, you investigate, and then there's an indictment. That's the document at the end, not a report. Prosecutors usually don't write reports; they write indictments, or they don't, or they write a memo that says we decline the case, an internal memo. Publicly, either there's an indictment or there's not. So what Mueller's trying to do is explain when there's going to be no charges, why go through all this effort to set forth all the details and go through all the facts and lock it all in. And I think the reasoning that Mueller and his team had is that, well, years later, somebody may try to prosecute this, and we want to have everything set forth in a way that, makes that a possibility, or can be, essentially it serves the purposes of that potential prosecution.
Earlier in the program today, we talked about what we learned yesterday, that there was both a letter and a phone conversation between Robert Mueller and William Barr, where, in short, Robert Mueller felt that if not the letter specifically, the sort of context and reaction to the letter mischaracterized the sort of general picture of what the Mueller report found. How significant is this? I mean, there are relatively few other examples that we can look at to compare what's happening here to what has happened historically. There are a couple. So can you kind of give us a sense of whether this is a big deal? Is it not a big deal?
I would say it's a very big deal. Mueller, I mean, the picture of Mueller that is painted by his report is an extraordinarily careful man. I don't think anybody, any lawyer, sophisticated lawyer reading that report can come away with anything other than enormous respect for the man and his work. I mean, I think it's something that demands, it's a work product that demands respect. And he's careful and he's cautious, as I mentioned a moment ago. And here he is in the days after the Barr letter is released, very pointedly, I'd say in the letter, pointedly, at least for Robert Mueller, making the case that, he claims that that there is a mischaracterization of the substance of his findings and the conclusions of his investigation. I think that for Robert Mueller, that's as close as you're going to ever get to something that is a 3-alarm fire or him making a very pointed statement. Very careful man. And so, yeah, I think it's very significant. I think the significance of it can be lost potentially to the public because unlike some of the pithy statements that Barr says that are made for television, Mueller is trying to do exactly the opposite. Mueller is trying to say things in a careful and guarded way. And even there, he's, I think, making some pretty strong statements. And really what I would just say here is, Mueller, I think, is dealing with Barr as if he's someone who has respect for the institution and cares about doing the right thing. I mean, what Mueller's telling him is, the public's being misled. You need to correct this. You need to do something about it. And I think what he didn't learn until it was too late is that Barr has no shame whatsoever. That even in the face of the public being misled, Barr was going to do nothing for weeks because that's exactly what Barr was trying to do.
Last thing I want to touch on, and this is really more of a political assessment than a legal one, on balance, based on everything that's happened until now, does impeachment of the president make sense, aside from whether it's politically viable and whether any Republicans in the Senate would actually say yes? What's your sense of whether there should be such proceedings?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not a politician, okay, so I'm not going to make a judgment as to what's going to happen in the Senate or how all that's going to work out. I can tell you as a lawyer that there's, more than sufficient evidence to charge Donald Trump with obstructing justice. And if he had resigned as president before Mueller concluded his investigation, I don't think there's a doubt in my mind that Mueller would have indicted him if he was no longer the sitting president. So Congress can decide to do what it will with that. There's all sorts of statements being made by Nancy Pelosi that it's not in their political interest to impeach. That's sort of beyond my expertise. I'm not going to tell Nancy Pelosi how to run her political operation. But I will say there is, more than sufficient evidence to do so. And frankly, there's much more evidence than there was. There was evidence, I would say, of a much more serious violation than the charges that ultimately resulted in the impeachment of Bill Clinton.
We've been speaking with Renato Mariotti, former federal prosecutor, CNN legal analyst, and also Politico Legal Affairs columnist. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.